Okay, so welcome. The goal of this video is to introduce you to the concept of coalitions in advocacy work. We'll talk about the importance of coalitions as well as cover some of the interesting dynamics that coalitions have as they play out in the real world. Our intent is to help you think a little bit more deeply about the kinds of coalitions you might be able to forge in your policy area, whatever that policy area might be. Before we get going, one disclaimer, this is not an exhaustive resource on coalitions. This is intended to supplement what we discuss in class and present in class, as well as any other readings that we might assign on this topic. So with that disclaimer, let's begin. So what are coalitions and why do they matter? Well, when you're trying to change policy, going it alone is usually not enough. Most successful advocates find ways to bring together different people and organizations and professionals into coalitions in order to get them, in order to get more people to work together and speak as one unified voice on that issue. One way to define a coalition is as follows. A coalition refers to a set of alliances that bring together people who are aligned around a shared policy goal. That's from Weibold and Ingold. I've also seen coalition defined as something that brings together people, sort of a variety of people who, quote, share a particular belief system and who show a non-trivial degree of coordinated activity over time, end quote. I kind of like that definition as well. That comes from the Advocacy Coalition Framework, and that's a scholarly framework described by Sabatier and Jenkins-Smith. So those are a few definitions. Okay, why do coalitions matter? First, I think coalitions, they give you more political clout. Policymakers are more likely to listen when they hear from a united front of stakeholders, not just one group or one person. What they want to hear from is a range of voices representing lots of different stakeholders. So in the case of health policy, any kind of coalition where you can, for instance, bring together patients and providers and public health experts, even business leaders and others, that can be an effective coalition. Why else do they matter? Well, second, coalitions add legitimacy to an idea. When your proposal is supported by people with different backgrounds and interests, it sort of signals that the policy isn't just good for one group. It has a broader value and appeal. And in the case of, when you're appealing to elected officials, well, that's something that kind of lowers the political risk of them agreeing to it, right? If it was just you showing up, they might be skeptical, or they might be worried that that this is your policy idea is just hiding some advantage for yourself. But when a whole coalition of different people with different interests and backgrounds shows up, then it sort of reduces that risk. Third, a coalition can expand your reach. Each member of the coalition presumably is going to bring something to the table, right? It's going to have its own network, maybe its own audience, and its own ability to influence people. Just think about the ability to combine mailing lists and contacts and so forth. So working together, you can reach more people, and you can raise public awareness and mobilize support and so on. Another reason, coalitions also help you share resources, whether it's research or funding or staff time and so on. It takes resources to do things. It takes resources to put on events or buy advertising or what have you. So pooling various types of assets can make your advocacy effort more likely to succeed. Another key benefit is strategic framing. Different coalition partners can tailor the message to resonate with different audiences. You might emphasize one thing to one audience or frame it differently for a different audience, and overall you're getting more people to sign on to your cause if you can do that. And there's sort of like a division of labor, comparative advantage here. with different coalition partners being able to do that for their audiences that they know best. One group might focus on cost savings, another might emphasize some equity or some other value, right? And it would appeal to different audiences. So together you can kind of speak more powerfully. And then finally, coalitions, they bring sustained pressure, or you can think of this as like staying power. So sort of like a long-term benefit. In the short run, individuals, organizations, and even individual people might come and go. Sometimes these issues and policy ideas that you're working on, these are multi-year projects, right? And people might come and go. But if you've got a solid coalition with many different organizations, and especially if your policy idea is sort of a long-term play, then coalitions will help you sustain that effort longer. Because when people kind of drift in and out of this effort, it will be more what's the word? It would have better lasting power. So in short, coalitions help you be basically just better, stronger, and more persuasive. Not all coalitions are the same. They vary in how they're formed and what holds them together and what each member hopes to gain. I don't know of any definitive taxonomy in the scholarly literature for this, but you might say that there are, let's say, 4 major types. Ideological, strategic, grassroots, and the 4th one I'll call cross-sector. So first, let's touch on the ideological coalitions. As the name suggests, these are groups that are united by shared values or beliefs. For example, organizations that all support single-payer healthcare because they believe that access to care is a fundamental human right. They might come together for that ideological reason. Or to take the same exact issue but the opposite side, groups that all oppose single-payer because they believe that we need to reform the way private insurance works in a different way, and that's the way forward. Well, that set of groups might come together and form an ideological coalition. Either way, the groups that come together, they're promoting one of those messages or the other. They share some sort of aligned worldview. Then you have the strategic coalitions, and these are more transactional in nature. These groups might not share the same values, but they do share a goal still. You might think of like a public health group and a tech company, both who support telehealth expansion, right? The public health group might really care about access to care in like rural regions, and the tech company, maybe they care about that too, but they care about market growth and putting their technology out there and seeing that it's used and that sort of thing. And that's okay. They could all come together and they might be able to work together on that same policy idea. Another type is grassroots and grass tops coalitions. You've probably heard of grassroots. I don't know if you've heard of grass tops, those terms. Grassroots coalitions mobilize everyday people, patients and parents and local advocates, let's say. Grass tops coalitions are usually, when people say that, they're usually talking about like institutional leaders, so like a hospital executive or the mayor of a city or a town, or like the CEO of some big company. And both of these types can be effective. I will say that if you don't navigate the grass tops quite right, it can come off as artificial or maybe insincere. And then what happens is, instead of you being able to refer to it as grass tops, which is a fine term, some people will pejoratively refer to it as astroturf. Oh, it's astroturf, it's fake grassroots, right? And so you just have to be careful about how you navigate that. It can be require some care. And then finally, we've got cross-sector coalitions, and these are partnerships that cut across traditional boundaries. maybe like different industries or just different sectors of life. So for instance, imagine like health and education and housing or business. These things, of course, they're all related in one sense, but they might not be considered traditionally lumped together. For example, you might imagine a coalition to address like some childhood condition, like childhood asthma. There's a health component to that. But if the idea that your solution, your program, and your policy that you're trying to get implemented involves a school, like treating the kids at the school or screening them at the school or something like that, it involves a school in some sense. Well, then it's going to be like almost like a cross-sector coalition there, because it's maybe informed by the research and expertise of pediatricians and environmental groups and that sort of thing, but it's ultimately going to need to involve the school officials as well, right? So it might be considered a cross-sector coalition, and those can be effective as well. All right, let's look at some historical examples. I thought it would be interesting to perhaps consider a few historical examples of coalitions, and not even necessarily from healthcare. I thought these just might be helpful to show because they're already well known. So first, you could look back to the women's suffrage movement. This wasn't just a fight led by activists like Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, individuals whose names we know really well. The suffrage movement, it really was a coalition. They built a broad coalition that included religious groups and labor unions. There were temperance advocates involved, progressive reformers of various types. You've got the NAWSA as well as the NWP. They were both big parts of this. And so ultimately, by the time the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, the coalition behind it had become really a pretty diverse and politically powerful force, and was responsible for a lot of that success. Another example might be the civil rights movement. So when we think of the 1960s or 1950s through the 1970s, we often focus on individual leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., but really what made the movement so successful was there were so many coalitions involved. Black churches, you had student organizations, labor unions, religious leaders, and others. They all came together, working together over these years. This coalition helped to get legislation passed, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, also the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Another movement, the marriage equality movement. This movement definitely utilized coalitions. Early advocates for same-sex marriage, they got things going and they started working with civil liberties organizations. But over time, the movement gained additional support from other groups. So there's definitely coalition work happening here. There was support from major corporations. There was certain religious allies appeared. There were even political groups like the Libertarian Party and many others. Some were driven by like the moral beliefs about fairness and dignity, and others saw it as a matter of personal liberty. So they're coming together for even different reasons in some cases. And then this one is an example of one that ultimately led to a Supreme Court decision. One more historical example, and then we'll continue. And this one actually is health related, the tobacco control movement. This whole campaign began as a public health fight, but it really moved itself ahead by building a wide coalition. Health professionals, school systems, anti-drug coalitions, parent groups joined up with the state governments. Private insurers got involved. Some private companies started to support anti-tobacco legislation and litigation as well. That was a big part of this. So this all, this whole coalition, they managed to get some major wins on things such as warning labels and advertising bans, as well as things like workplace laws about secondhand smoke. So yeah, those are some brief historical examples that I hope should feel, the examples themselves should feel pretty familiar to you, but maybe if you never thought of them or saw them through the lens of coalitions, then this is a nice little review. Okay, moving on. Another useful framework, there's one more conceptual framework that I'd like to introduce to you. We'll do a couple of slides on this and then I'll close things out. The name of this coalition-related concept is, or framework, I should say, is the Bootleggers and the Baptists. Kind of a alliterative term that has definitely stuck around. And it's a way of looking at a certain type of sort of tacit coalition that comes up all the time in the policy world. You'll definitely hear about it at some point if you're working in policy, so you might as well learn about it here. It comes from economist Bruce Yandle, who first described it in the 1980s. And the basic point is that it's kind of an observation that policy is often driven by coalitions that bring together one or more groups who will serve or play the role of the moral justifiers on the one hand, and then also one or more groups to be the economic justifiers for something, or even sometimes they'll actually serve as the economic beneficiaries for something. But either way, it's this marriage of moral justification and economic justification together, which can be an effective type of coalition. The arch example, and obviously also where this framework gets its name from, is prohibition. That, if you don't recall, was the time in this country from 1920 to about 1933 in which the manufacture and sale and transportation of alcohol was completely banned nationwide. There's a nationwide prohibition on alcohol. So you might wonder, well, how do we get that coalition, or how do we get that policy? The kind of coalition that supported that policy, well, on the one hand, on the moral justification side, you had a variety of people. You had some religious groups, for instance. They were willing to go along with it because they saw a ban on alcohol as something that was morally clean and right. So, in the whole Bootleggers and Baptists term there, that's where we get the Baptists in that name. They weren't the only ones, but it's probably just because it makes for a catchy name, right? With the double B there. So that's where you get the Baptists. Who else supported it? Well, the people who were willing to supply alcohol illegally and get an extra high profit for taking on the risk of doing that, those people are referred to as bootleggers. That's the term for that. And so, the reason that they're happy with the ban, with that kind of policy of prohibition, is because being a supplier on the black market is actually much more profitable than just competing straight up in a normal market with legal producers. It is also risky, but you can also make more. You can make more profit. So anyway, both groups, want this same policy, but for very different reasons, right? And so that's what makes this an interesting kind of framework. This Bootleggers and Baptists dynamic, where you've got a moral argument providing some public cover, and then an economic interest, also benefiting. It's actually very common. It can be quite effective because moral arguments can be very effective. We know that, right? So whoever is assuming the role of the quote Baptists for a given issue, it's not literally the Baptists. I mean, you get that. It's just a term and a framework here. But whoever's assuming that role, they're going to have a certain role to play in advancing the moral part of the case, and then policy, advocacy efforts and movements, they also need like funding and lobbying muscle and that sort of thing. And so whoever assumes the role of the bootleggers is usually, playing that economic role. and making those things happen. And it actually, when you look at this, it actually is kind of ironic in that working together in this way, it can take some ideas and make them a whole lot more appealing, or even more bipartisan than they otherwise would have been. So it's an interesting and kind of fascinating coalition type framework to look at issues through. Here are some examples where you might say that there are actually some bootlegger and Baptist dynamics happening today. For example, let's take sugary beverage taxes, right? You're familiar with these. Public health advocates, maybe dentists, maybe, I don't know, natural food advocates. They might support these kinds of things, that sort of policy from a moral standpoint, right? Like, this is the way to be, this is the right thing to do. And so they might play the quote Baptist role, right? On the quote bootlegger role side, that might be played by like bottled water companies, or companies that sell other food and beverage substitutes, even insurers maybe, right? I mean, they could see how this might benefit them economically if it's effective, right? So anyway, those interests who might do better financially with this policy in place, they would be on the bootlegger side. You could even say, government officials might even be thought of on the bootlegger kind of side of this equation, because if the design of the policy is such that the revenue that is raised from the tax gets to be spent by the state government, then that's a reason for government officials to be, in it in a sort of self-interested way, right? Moving on, you might see this in tobacco regulations too. Some groups in that coalition support the regulations for basically moral reasons, and other groups because they also stand to benefit in a more of a material way. There's another example would be certificate of need laws, possibly. You could look at that issue in this way. Those are laws that restrict hospitals and other organizations from opening new facilities or adding new beds unless there's a demonstrated need, like to the community. There's some people who support that idea because they believe it's like the right thing to do from various standpoints, like an access standpoint or even a cost management kind of standpoint. And of course, there are others who stand to benefit. For instance, the incumbent hospitals who would probably be happy, to limit competition in their area so that they're the only provider of some service, right? And then finally, the coalition that has emerged around the war on drugs. It could also be seen as a case of bootleggers and Baptists. In fact, this one is almost a straight replay of the whole prohibition example. Similar kinds of groups on each side for similar kinds of reasons. At any rate, the Bootleggers and Baptists framework, I think it's pretty useful and helpful. It's very common. You'll hear about it. So you can use that strategically to figure out how you might form coalitions to get something passed. Interestingly, you can also, as we see here, you can use it kind of proactively and prospectively to think about what kind of coalition you'd like to form strategically. You can also kind of use it as a retrospective or forensic tool to kind of look back on a past policy. Maybe you've been wondering, how did that policy ever get passed? And you can sometimes go back and understand something retrospectively to understand why it got passed through this kind of framework, and it can be helpful. Okay, so last slide, wrapping up. Building a strong coalition is not just about gathering as many supporters as possible. It's also about being strategic and intentional. Obviously, you need to identify key stakeholders, who cares about this issue, who might be affected by it. You already know how to do this at this point in the course, so we'll move on. The next thing that's important in this in coalitions is to recruit diverse perspectives. This can be something that's good to remember. Don't just gather people who already agree with you. The strongest coalitions bring together different voices, people who approach the same issue but from multiple angles. That will help you solve problems more creatively if you have that kind of diverse input. It also will help you reach a broader audience, as we discussed earlier. Kind of next on this list of reminders and tips and advice and everything, identify overlapping interests. So even if groups have different reasons for being at the table, look for that shared ground. What's the policy win that benefits everyone? Next, know your partner's motives. It kind of dovetails with the previous one on overlapping interests and looking for shared ground. But more specifically, understand what each group wants and why they're involved and why are they there in the first place. Also, understanding everybody's motives helps you navigate challenges and also avoid surprises. And especially in coalitions that mix kind of moral and economic interests, like the Bootlegger and Baptist types of coalitions. You might be aligned in one part, but you might be at odds with each other in some other issue or something like that. So you want to, know not to go there, or if you do encounter that some other issue or something like that, you've got a way of working through it because you've already thought through it. Next, set clear goals and boundaries. Be honest and upfront about what your goals and boundaries are. This prevents the coalition from having mission creep, which can be a coalition killer. And also, again, helps to avoid internal conflict. Another thing here, anticipate public perception. Coalitions can raise eyebrows, especially if they include unlikely allies. Those unlikely allies sometimes are called strange bedfellows. You might have heard that term before. So just think ahead about how the public media or policymakers or just the public might react, and be ready to explain why you've got the people in your coalition that you do. Finally, communicate with authenticity. Trust comes from being open and honest, and really the best coalitions are built over time, based on kind of long-term relationships and aren't just these sort of short-term, transactional agreements. So that's all right. Well, that's it for this time. I hope that was interesting and clarifying. And remember, if you have questions, let us know, and we can explore this some more in class. So thank you for your time.